What is the fantasy football outlook for the Buffalo Bills skill players? I'm joined by fantasy expert Scott Barrett to break it all down today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I'm joined now by Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points. You can follow him on X at Scott Barrett DFB. And he's here to break down a fascinating topic. It's the Buffalo Bills 2024 fantasy football outlook. And Scott, I'm excited to dive into this with you. But I got to start here. Anytime that I go and I visit your profile on X, I see a picture of Kyle Orton in a Bills uniform with the Bills visor on. And so, what's the story? What's going on with that?
I just love Kyle Orton. I think it started off as a meme, but that was like a miracle run year in my mind. Like he had retired from football, right? And the head coach, I think he like drives all the way to Arkansas, finds him on a bar stool somewhere, and like begs him to come back and play football, and become dangerously close to making the playoffs that year. Like he almost, turned around that team, and it was just. Love seeing him at the post-draft press conference. He just like dressed up like he's wearing like leisure suits from the 70s, and he had that mustache. He just like didn't want to be there.
Right.
And like gave the funniest answers. And then at the end of the year, right, like he was talking to a reporter at his locker room. I think this is how the story goes. He's talking to a reporter in the locker room, and he was like, hold on one second, I got to run. And then he just left and never came back. And I think, they begged him to come back, and he's just, no, I'm just done. I'm just so out. I've been out for so long. Jay Cutler has that decaf reputation, but I think Kyle Orton supplants him on my list as the top decaf quarterback ever.
It's a heck of a vibe. Yeah. You have all the details correctly there, and almost broke the playoff drought for the Bills. Really good stretch of quarterback play. Probably when you think of Josh Allen and then you go probably back to like Doug Flutie or like 8 games of Drew Bledsoe, might have been the best stretch of quarterback play the Bills saw since Jim Kelly retired. So I think Kyle Orton's always going to have a soft place in the hearts of Bills Mafia, but then also the weirdest ever ending for a career. And he went out. Who knows what he's doing? I promise you, Kyle Orton's having a good time. That's one thing we could probably agree on as it relates to Kyle Orton. Scott, we're going to talk Bills fantasy football outlook today. And I like to play fantasy football. I really like dynasty fantasy football. In fact, I'm so into dynasty fantasy football that I don't even really enjoy redraft leagues anymore. But I think I know football pretty well. And I think that's what makes me just kind of average at fantasy football, because I get into scheme and X's and O's and skill sets and matchups. And that dictates a lot of my opinions on fantasy projections, where you and the really good fantasy people, you're into the data. Like, you just keep the main thing. What are the data points that are predictors of future success, and what does the production actually look like with any level of consistency? And I think that's where people like you really excel. And that's why I'm excited to get your opinion today on the Bills fantasy outlook. So let's do that. And let's start with the player everybody talks about, Josh Allen. Typically one of the top performing fantasy quarterbacks every year, but there's a lot of new dynamics for the Bills. I'm sure you're aware of this, but Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis are no longer part of the equation. In fact, 57% of Josh Allen's targets from last year have been vacated. Khalil Shakir, the only wide receiver on the roster to have caught a pass from Josh Allen in a game. How do you put all this together and come up with the appropriate fantasy outlook for Josh Allen?
Yeah, so you just talked about the distinctions between fantasy football and real NFL football, and a gigantic one is the importance of rushing at the fantasy position. It's one of the biggest, most potent edges in fantasy. It's a cheat code. A quarterback who runs 100 passing yards and a touchdown through the air is equivalent to 20 yards and a touchdown on the ground. So major edge there. And so what happened? Like you said, you lost the weapons. Josh Allen signs the big contract. You lose Stefon Diggs. You lose Gabe Davis. And so what? Now the expectation is for Josh Allen to be Superman, right? And I could nitpick. I can raise some concerns. But at the end of the day, if passing efficiency drops due to the loss of Stefon Diggs, he's probably going to run more. If the defense falters, he's probably going to run more. If guys aren't getting open, he's probably going to run more. And so I just don't think there's any way you can't rank him easily as the top quarterback in fantasy football. He's finished top 2 in fantasy points per game in each of the last 4 seasons. Last year, he outscored the next closest quarterback by nearly 40 points. And on the ground, he ranks top 5 in career rushing yards per game among all quarterbacks all time. Only Derrick Henry has more rushing touchdowns since he entered the league. So to me, easy QB1 in fantasy football. And on top of the rushing element is like, the guy is so damn good. Like, I don't know where you have him ranked, like in NFL rankings, but no worse than as the second best quarterback in football. I think if you want to throw out the clutch component, just because Patrick Mahomes is so insane there, like if you want to argue he's the best quarterback in football, I'd take no issue with that. So the guy is damn good. He runs. He has everything you want. Easy QB1 in fantasy. And now I think we're seeing quarterbacks, we're always overrated in fantasy, but these days, and especially when you're talking about, the premier at the position, a little underrated. If you want to be a Bills homer and draft Josh Allen in round 2 of your draft, I could sign off on that.
Well, that's always the challenge with it's when to draft the big quarterback. And it seems like they score the most points, but there's this belief that there's a lot of guys that score a lot of points at quarterback. So you can maybe wait and go for some other positions. But, I could see go ahead and get Josh Allen and know that you're probably going to get in standard scoring 20 to 30 points every single week out of the player. So Scott Barrett in on Josh Allen as the premier quarterback when it comes to fantasy football. I think his top target's going to be Dalton Kincaid. Obviously, the Bills have a lot invested there, a first-round pick. They also traded a fourth-round pick to go get him, and I think he's very much a breakout candidate. I don't think that's much of a hot take. And I think he showcased a lot as a rookie, and as a guy that had over 90 targets as a rookie, you're feeling pretty good about where he's going to fall in the pecking order with so much new in terms of weapons around Josh Allen. And so where do you think the production can land for Dalton Kincaid? Can he be one of the top producing fantasy tight ends in all the league?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky one for me. And again, it goes back to the important distinction of fantasy football versus real NFL. But like, I'm looking at this offense and I'm wondering if the Bills are sort of intentionally mirroring the post Tyreek Chiefs, right? They lose Tyreek Hill, maybe the best wide receiver in football. They win back-to-back Super Bowls. Bills have just lost Stefon Diggs, and you saw the play caller change to Joe Brady. The Bills sort of moving in this direction. They're going a little more run heavy, more spread the ball around. Kincaid, obviously more heavily involved. Could he be the Bills' Travis Kelce? This is a player I loved coming out of college. Very excited about. Massive potential, massive upside. But from a fantasy standpoint, I'll say I'm not as excited about him at current ADP, where he's tight end 3. It comes down to the range of outcomes, because let's not forget. So like last year, without Dawson Knox, Dalton Kincaid was averaging 14 fantasy points per game. Those are tight end 4 numbers, 20% target share, tight end 6, 76% route share. But with Dawson Knox, route share went down to 60%, target share down to 14%, 7.5 fantasy points per game. That's tight end 18, tight end 19 numbers. And sure, you could say, well, he hit 80 yards twice with Dawson Knox. That was week 17 and 18. but his snap share was only at 56%, 61%. Route share a little bit better, 71%. That's like tight end 15 range. But still, like, what are you seeing here? You're seeing Dawson Knox sort of eat into his production. And this is what you've always seen, like Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, they cannibalize each other's upside. And so what you really want at the tight end position is you want that upside. It's historically a position that exists wholly without a middle class. You have like 2 to 3 oligarch tight ends ruling over a vast swath of peasants. And so you really want that highest end production. And I'm skeptical he can hit that with Dawson Knox there. The Bills, when they had Dawson Knox, their rate of 12 personnel was 30%. Without Dawson Knox, it was 4%. And I really don't see them turning away from that, because Bills in 12 personnel, 8.01 adjusted net yards per attempt. In 11 personnel, 5.93 adjusted net yards per attempt. So basically way better in 12 personnel. So that's not good for Dalton Kincaid, but it is good for the offense. So I don't see that changing. But hey, if I'm wrong, or if Dawson Knox were to suffer an injury, yeah, this guy has massive league winning, fantasy breaking potential. And again, for Dynasty, very bullish on the player, but just current redraft leagues, I think a little overpriced. I don't think people are factoring in enough just how much a thorn Dawson Knox could be in his side.
Well, I see 120 targets for Dalton Kincaid. And if that's the case, that probably justifies the tight end 3 ADP where he's hanging out right now. It feels like maybe your skepticism isn't necessarily about anything about Dalton Kincaid. You think the reality of the market share is maybe where people are overrating it.
Yeah. Again, I mean, he is going to be the Bills' Travis Kelce. Like, that's very possible. You're just going to need to see less from Dawson Knox in order for that to be the case for fantasy. Like, Kelce had this massive cheat code advantage on all other tight ends. George Kittle was the guy who's led the position in yards per route run nearly every year of his career, but he's at a disadvantage to Travis Kelce, who pass first offense and minimal competition, rarely being asked to pass block. So it was like he was playing 5 quarters per game to Kittle's 4 quarters per game. And so now you factor in Kincaid losing some work to Dawson Knox. Maybe it's, 2.75 quarters to like Travis Kelce in his primes 5, something like. It's just a disadvantage. And Dawson Knox being there is a concern for fantasy. Yeah, maybe I don't like that target projection. But again, I could be wrong. And I really do like the player. But right now I'm thinking he's a little overpriced, and I think the wide receivers are better values.
Folks, the NFL schedule has been released, and there's so many high-profile games for the Buffalo Bills and all the teams across the country. Maybe you want to get to some of these games. If so, you got to download the Game Time app. Game Time is the fast and easy way to purchase tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. It's an awesome app. It's easy to navigate. They have so many great features, including flash deals, last-minute ticket specials. They give you a seat view so you know exactly what to expect when you get to the venue. But my favorite part is the all-in price. You know the exact price that you're going to pay at the end of the purchase transaction from the outset. They don't hide any fees. They're right there from the beginning. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, a player that I'm really excited to get into is James Cook. Had a breakout season in 2023. He received more volume than any back that we've seen yet under Sean McDermott. 10th in the NFL in touches, 6th in yards from scrimmage, over 1,500 yards from scrimmage. I never thought we would see a Bills back with Josh Allen get that type of production. And I know that you kind of look at teams and say, okay, good offense that feeds you the football. That's a great recipe for fantasy. Where are you at with James Cook?
Yeah, so I just want to say I like the player a lot. Freakishly efficient over the last 2 seasons. He ranks 2nd in yards from scrimmage per touch, 2nd in explosive run rate, 5th in yards per carry, 5th in yards per target, 6th in yards per route run. So what do you see there? Really high levels of efficiency as both a runner and a pass catcher. Pass catching backs are another one of those fantasy cheat codes, especially in PPR leagues. I will say, just some added context for these numbers, he was running predominantly against light fronts, one of the highest light front rate of any running back over the last 2 seasons. All that is great. All that is really good. You saw the touches, the opportunities with Joe Brady at the tail end of last year, who also, the Bills were far more run heavy under Joe Brady. But again, in fantasy, we're talking about fantasy cheat codes or things that are massively impactful. And one of those, obviously, is touchdowns, where one touchdown is worth 60 yards. And James Cook had 1,567 yards from scrimmage last year, only 2 rushing touchdowns. That's crazy. He only had 5 of the team's 35 carries inside the 5. And so that massively, cuts his upside short. He's going to offset that a little bit with the PPRs, those receptions and passing down work. But I just don't think they like him as a goal line back. And then you have Josh Allen vulturing the touchdowns himself with his legs. Maybe Ray Davis works more on early downs as well. And so, I think you can say he's a value based on ADP, but he's not someone I'm excited to draft because I question his highest end potential.
Yeah, you worry about the touchdowns, right? Like, what did Josh Allen have? Over 15 last year. He tied the NFL record, him and Jalen Hurts last year. And while I'm sure the Bills would love to take some of that off of Josh Allen, they'd also love to score those touchdowns. And Josh Allen's very good at doing that. So I definitely understand your angle there with James Cook. And yeah, I'm nervous about the touchdowns being there. Let me sidebar here if I can, because receiving touchdowns are always interesting to me. I personally think they're kind of random. And I guess you could maybe look at a guy like Dalton Kincaid and think, yeah, maybe you would have liked more receiving touchdowns there. But am I right in thinking that there's a lot of variance year over year when it comes to receiving touchdowns?
No, so that's absolutely right. And so something I do with projecting out the tight end position is I'll actually just remove touchdowns. So I'll look at receiving fantasy points per game minus touchdowns, and that proves to be more predictive in the following season than including them. I will say, as a caveat, there are certain stats you can look at to make that a lot better. At fantasy points, we use expected touchdowns, which is even more predictive. But we'll get to that when we discuss Keon Coleman. He is someone I think has massive touchdown upside in this offense.
All right, we'll get there. I do want to ask you about Khalil Shakir first, because he kind of broke out last year. Over the last 12 games in 2023, including the playoffs, Khalil Shakir led the Bills in receiving yards. And my favorite stat, from week 7 on, he outproduced Stefon Diggs on 60 less targets. That's insane. Last week on First Read, podcast that I'm doing with Brett Whitefield for Fantasy Points, everyone should check that out. He gushed about Shakir. He brought all this data to the table that suggests a monster year is coming for Khalil Shakir. Are you there? Are you excited about the fantasy upside of Khalil Shakir?
For Dynasty, I said I am. For redraft, I think it's a little more complicated. I just said, Dalton Kincaid, I think, is a little overdrafted at ADP in redraft. But there's a case that all of the wide receivers are way too cheap in redraft right now. So Joe Brady in 2020, his only full year as a play caller, he had Teddy Bridgewater at quarterback. He had 3 wide receivers finished top 25 in total fantasy points. Right now, Joe Brady's wide receivers with Josh Allen at quarterback, Keon Coleman's wide receiver 41 at ADP, Curtis Samuel's wide receiver 50, Khalil Shakir is wide receiver 54. So I know Brett's love for Shakir, and I absolutely get it. The guy led all receivers in yards per target last season, all wide receivers with 20 or more targets. And that's a stat that regresses to the mean, but it's predictive of future volume. So like, if you rank that highly, chances are you're going to earn yourself more work in the following season, because that was just so impressive. And like, you look for, second, third year breakouts. It's typically players who rank super high in that stat, like Adam Thielen a number of years ago before his breakout led in yards per target. And so I think there's talent there. My question is, how do you see this depth chart shaking up? I talked to Brett about this. I know he loves Shakir. He sees it as Coleman starting on the outside, Shakir starting opposite him, and Curtis Samuel in the slot. I see it a different way, and I think most people see it this way, is Curtis Samuel is playing on the outside, he was predominantly in the slot last year, but under Joe Brady, he was, I don't know, outside 70% of the time. And so that's kind of how I see it. And remember, I talked about the Bills playing more 12 personnel when Dawson Knox was healthy and then being more effective. And so what happens there is the slot wide receivers coming off the field. So I don't see, if that's Shakir, I don't see him being a difference maker in redraft leagues. But maybe Brett is right, and he's going to be the starting wide receiver on the outside opposite Coleman, in which case, yeah, wheels up. Let's get excited about it. But right now, I mean, it's a guy who's cleared 30 routes in a game only 3 times in his career. So I don't know. It's a little bit of a leap of faith, but I am seeing all the underlying efficiency metrics that Brett is seeing, where you can point to that potential.
That's what's fascinating about what you said there was the ADP order of the Bills receivers. If I'm not mistaken, it was Coleman, Samuel, and then Shakir.
That's right.
I would flip that upside down. Like, personally.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, for fantasy purposes, I would want them in the complete opposite order.
So who's the starting slot?
Probably Shakir. That would be my guess, but I think he's interchangeable with Curtis Samuel. So I feel like you're going to see them both play in the slot and outside.
Here's the more important point. Who is starting in 2 wide receiver sets?
I think it could change week to week. I think the Bills are going to be a mess for fantasy purposes.
All right,
well, it's like Patriots running backs, like 5-6 years ago. I think it's, for real football, it's a different conversation, but we're not having a real football conversation. I know that it goes hand in hand, but yeah, I think it could be certain games. They like certain matchups and certain skill sets against those defenses better. And that probably makes it tough when you're doing what you do. And I respect what you're doing. And through this conversation, I'm learning how much I don't know about how you get to these conclusions. But there's obviously a very clear process that goes behind it. And I think it's very fascinating.
Yeah, I will just say I was referencing best ball ADP. And so, like, your point where it's going to be a mess week to week, that stinks in start sit leagues. But in best ball, you can get away with that, where it automatically starts your highest scoring players each week, and you don't get penalized for their dud games. And so, yeah, Bills in best ball, very underpriced. In a start sit, I think you're right. But ultimately, to me, what it comes down to for Shakir is he starting in those 2 wide receiver sets for a team that was much more efficient in 12 personnel. But Curtis Samuel is not without his warts. He was great under Joe Brady, but that was a number of years ago. He ranked bottom 5 among all wide receivers in ESPN's open score. And that was despite ranking top 5 in percentage of targets coming against linebackers and coverage, which is another efficiency cheat code. Slot wide receivers against linebackers and coverage, major cheat code. In spite of that, though, again, bottom 5 in open score. Maybe he was misused in Washington, or maybe he's lost a step, or because Shakir ranked much higher by that same stat. So wouldn't shock me if Brett proves to be right and Shakir beats him outright. But these are the concerns that are rumbling through my head at the moment.
Let's go to the Curtis Samuel question, then we'll circle back to Keon Coleman, because I feel like we're on a nice little path here talking Curtis Samuel. And I think there's a lot of excitement for him in Buffalo, obviously the speed dynamic, but the last time he was with Joe Brady, he went over 1,000 yards from scrimmage, as you pointed out, with Teddy Bridgewater as a quarterback 2020 with Carolina. And I mean, I think in 7 seasons, Curtis Samuel's had 5 different offensive coordinators, and obviously not a very impressive list of quarterbacks he's had a chance to play with. But I do go back to that 2020 season. He received 97 targets. He got a career high 41 rushing attempts. They gave him some decent money. Again, the Bills didn't have a lot of cap space to play with. They certainly targeted Curtis Samuel and brought him in. Where's the fantasy value?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? He makes more money per year than Jamar Chase right now. He has that history and track record with Joe Brady, tremendous success in that 2020 season, providing like an added boost on the ground. But he wasn't good last year, maybe just a poor scheme fit or was misused. And Shakir was so much more efficient. And so you're weighing those. I'll say I think Samuel is a lot safer right now, but maybe Shakir has more upside.
All right, folks, we got more to get to with Scott Barrett, so be sure to stick with us. All right, you mentioned that you had some interesting nuggets as it relates to Keon Coleman. He hasn't played yet, but he certainly made a bit of a name for himself with his personality so far this offseason. I know projecting rookies is really, really difficult, but at least we know what team he plays for. That makes it a little bit better. Again, we think this Bills team is going to share the ball, but obviously the Bills. I mean, this is the top pick that they had, and he's gives them this X-type receiver that they're looking for. Where are you slotting Keon Coleman among, I guess, not only just the Bills, but the rookie class of receivers in general?
Yeah, so I did not like Keon Coleman coming out. He was my pre-draft wide receiver 13. But obviously, like, this landing spot is great, especially for Dynasty. He's catching passes from Josh Allen, one of the top 2 best quarterbacks in football. There's a whole bunch of targets available now with Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis gone. Beane has basically said he's going to be their starting X. They're going to lean on him. They're going to count on him as early as possible. So it's a great spot to be in, even if I'm not that sold on the player. And what I think is most interesting is I think he can easily score double-digit touchdowns this year. And remember, this is a guy I was not that high on. I thought that quote was so funny, where his first trip to the stadium, he's like, damn, I just scored 3 imaginary touchdowns, right? And it's like,
do those count? Can we apply those if you draft Keon Coleman? Can they apply to week 1? Right?
Unfortunately, no. But I could see double-digit real non-imaginary touchdowns. He didn't lead Florida State in yards per game last year, but he did have 5.5 times as many receiving touchdowns as the next closest receiver. Keep in mind, he had Johnny Wilson, who is, I don't know, 6'7", and he was freakishly efficient at scoring touchdowns in high school. In my article, my big rookie model article, I rarely ever used high school stats, but I had to for this one. As a high school junior, he had 35 catches and 22 touchdowns.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Wow.
And so why am I projecting double-digit touchdowns? Is Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis accounted for 81% of Buffalo's end zone targets last season. 29 of 36. No other teammate had more than 3. That's a knock against Kincaid. You're hoping he gets more end zone targets, and why shouldn't he? But it's just, you lose that. Who's the most likely recipient? To me, it has to be Keon Coleman, who's shown he can be so good at converting end zone targets into touchdowns.
I think the reason I'm so high on Shakir and Kincaid, not only they were the catalyst for the offense down the stretch, but if there's anything that I feel like I've learned about Josh Allen through the years, is that he makes decisions with the football based on players he trusts. And I think there's no better evidence of that than what you just said. Last year, Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis accounted for 81%, 29 of 36 of the Bills' end zone targets last year. He's throwing the ball to people that he trusts. Those are the guys. Like, everyone else is new this year. And so if there is something to be said for what I'm saying about Josh Allen and wanting to go to the ball with the players he trusts, I feel like Shakir and Kincaid are going to claim and gobble up a ton of these targets, but we will see.
I think that's a great point. That's, quarterback rapport matters, and that's an important variable that needs to go into the equation. I think that's absolutely right. You see that. So in DFS, like daily fantasy football, another one of these cheat codes I've used for years is instances where the starting quarterback gets hurt and a starting wide receiver gets hurt, and a backup quarterback comes in, and there's also a backup wide receiver now starting. That backup wide receiver is great in DFS. Why? Because they've spent so much practice time together. That's more his guy. They have that proven rapport. And so, yeah, you might be right. It's just Josh Allen knows these guys, trusts these guys, and you have so much turnover. I think that's a great point. I think you're right. That certainly could be the case.
Fascinating to see how this all shakes out. We talked about a lot of players, Scott, and there's more. You're talking about sharing the ball. There's guys like Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Chase Claypool, Dawson Knox, Ray Davis, Ty Johnson. Any of these guys have any fantasy relevancy? And I asked that now that we're at the end of the conversation, and we kind of work through a lot of these players, and it's kind of hard to tell, like, even with kind of the premier names, what their fantasy impact is going to be. Do you see any of these other guys, if you will, being fantasy relevant? barring injury, of course.
I certainly hope not. I certainly hope not. If that is the case, that makes matters a little bit worse. We were just talking about Buffalo emulating Kansas City, and one of the most frustrating things about that offense, like as productive as they weren't really supporting many fantasy players who were valuable for fantasy. Like Kelsey was valuable, but it was a down year for him. Rashee Rice, was underwhelming until the second half. And part of that was because they had this gross, like 4-way wide receiver by committee situation. And if that's what the Bills do with Marquez Valdes-Scantling, maybe even also Chase Claypool, that's going to drag down everyone else. And like I said, they're already kind of doing that with the tight ends, which you don't like to see. Maybe Chase Claypool's a thing because he's flashed once or twice. But I think the one player maybe we're underrating here is one you didn't mention, which is Mac Hollins. I do this thing every year, this post-draft presser review where I watch every single post-draft press conference. It takes 80 hours, and I do a podcast on it. And one of my takeaways is how weirdly high Brandon Beane seemed on Mac Hollins. Really seemed like, he expects him to make a difference this year in some capacity. Maybe if Keon Coleman struggles, maybe he's their starting X to start off the year. But yeah, just the bottom line is, if these guys are getting meaningful routes, it's not a good thing for fantasy.
Scott, I'm glad you brought up Mac Hollins, because I think a lot of the listeners to this podcast think I'm crazy for even thinking Mac Hollins has a chance to be a thing. They think I'm not going to say everybody. There's people out there that think he was a nothing signing for this team. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. And you mentioned, you listen to that Beane presser after the draft, that has come up repeatedly in the media circuit that Brandon Beane's went through. Even Sean McDermott's spoken highly of him. You've heard some of the players say, who's the guy that's bringing the juice and the energy from the new players brought in. They all say Mac Hollins. I love that you went there. I gave you all these players and I didn't even put them down. So I think it's a heck of a way to close out what I would label as a complicated conversation as it relates to the Buffalo Bills 2024 fantasy outlook. They could be an amazing offense, but still very troubling for you fantasy experts out there. Scott, really appreciate your preparation and all that you put into this conversation. It was everything I hoped it would be, and I couldn't appreciate it even more.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, folks, as always, I kindly ask that you share, subscribe, rate, and review. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills! And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.